All right, now that I have most of the middle ground filled in, I'm going to start working towards the foreground and getting the average lightest value in each spot. So starting here, the value I notice gets a little bit lighter. The leaves here are a little bit lighter than the leaves back here. Again, there's some spots in this tree that have little bits of light. That's the value I'm mixing up. That's what I'm starting from. Then I notice it's going a little bit darker here. And the trunks here are about the same value. So I'm going to fill that in. On this side, I'm going to go for the lighter value in the trunk. And then I notice that the trunk gets a little bit darker on this side. I can do that now. Again, that's more of a detail, but anything I can get away with doing right away, I will do. Okay, so here the trunk disappears under the leaves. Look for the lightest value. It's going to be pretty light. In fact, there's some spots where these leaves are almost the same value as the sky. Let's do that. Let's leave them alone. Let's see if we can reserve some of the lighter value here. And then the leaves here are going darker, definitely. Don't worry about getting the smaller branches. That's something that you're going to get later. Don't worry about getting the shadows. Just get the shape of the leaves, the outline. These are tricky areas. These are places where there's not huge bundles of leaves. The leaves are sort of separate. Keep the texture here small because this tree is pretty far away. It's not a foreground tree, it's more of a middle ground tree. And the leaf texture here should be really, really fine. Everybody, this takes a little bit of practice, right? Getting these kinds of textures. We've got a trunk here. I'm going to fill that in. A branch here. We're going to fill that in. Don't worry about the smaller branches again. I'll put them in later. That's all sort of detail. There's another branch running this way. I can put that in. A few other branches. I notice that the branches are getting a little bit darker. They're being silhouetted by the sky here, which is what's going on. Let's blend that in. And get a few more leaves here and there. Principle of atmospheric perspective states that the closer something is, the more texture it's going to have. So as I'm working forward, I'm going to increase the leaf texture. I'm going to make it a little bit stronger. And when you're dealing with stuff in the background, it helps to fuse things a little bit, to blend things together, to not make the texture, the details quite so strong. So the stuff back here, right, I kind of simplified it. I'm not going to add a lot of detail, a lot of strong darks back there. Okay, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. I haven't touched that area yet. We'll get there once we filled in everything with some kind of wash. All right, now let's start working on this side now that this edge is dry. Let's fill in this trunk with a slightly lighter value. And then we've got some lighter spots on this trunk, which means that we need to fill this entire trunk with some kind of lighter value. Always look for the lighter value and fill the whole thing with that value before starting to go darker. And again, don't throw yourself into detail until all of your values are blocked in. So here we have a lot of really dark leaves. This is going to blend and bleed. I don't mind though, it's not a big deal. We've got some really dark leaves here. Again, I'm looking for the lighter value though first. Got some strong darks here, and then the leaves over here on this side are getting a little bit lighter. Look for the lighter value. Let's get a little bit of texture here. Okay, we have a few other spots to deal with. The edge of the road here, I'm trying to look through my tripod, goes a little bit darker. Let me just block that in. I want to get rid of the white, basically, as much as possible. All right, okay, so we have some leaves over here. Here, the leaf texture is going to be really strong, or pretty strong, relatively strong. And there's going to be places where I'm going to leave the leaves alone. All right, so what I'm doing here is I'm putting in the shadows, the separations between the leaves here. This is an approximation, so I'm applying a texture that sort of looks like the leaves there. I'm obviously not counting leaves. I'm creating a bunch of strokes that look like leaves. I'm suggesting the detail rather than trying to get something that's perfectly accurate. Look, it's not a tree portrait, right? I'm not trying to get a likeness here. I'm just trying to get something that looks leafy, that looks like the leaves that are in this tree. Okay, so it's darker over here. These leaves are in shadow. Again, this is not the finished product. This is essentially the underpainting, right? This is the setup process. So here the leaves are a little bit darker. Always looking for the lightest value, even in the shadow. Okay, so the trunk here is very similar in value to the leaves. So I'm going to fill it in with the same value, and then get a distinction once I start going into detail. So I'm just going to wash that in. There's a shadow here. Okay, my blocking stage is pretty close to done. I am working really quickly. You guys don't work quite as fast. I'm trying not to take up too much of your time. Alright, so then we have some tree branches here that are silhouetted by the sky. More leaves. Okay, so now that all of my general values have been washed in, I'm going to repeat the process of going background to foreground and start putting in all of the textures, all of the details. So I'm going to start off with the mountains here and put in a little tiny bit of the variation between the lighter parts and the shadow parts. Pay very close attention to atmospheric perspective. The shadows on the mountains here have to be very, very light in order for them to appear like they're in the distance. Try to simplify the textures here. Try to reduce things down. Try not to show quite as many brush strokes. Keep the stuff back here very, very simple. So I'm probably not going to go much darker here. In fact, I'm not going to go darker here at all, other than that. Okay, now let's start working our way forward. In fact, let me lighten some of this stuff. It's going a little too dark. Okay, now we're working a little bit darker here to get a little bit of detail. So here the darks are going to go a little bit darker, the texture is going to be a little bit sharper, but just by a touch, just by a little tiny bit. And as I'm working here, I'm going to make the texture a little tiny bit stronger. So even here, there needs to be some distinctions in depth. So I'm seeing some individual trees here. Again, I'm reducing the details that I'm seeing. I'm trying to approximate the look of what's there as opposed to painting every single little house, which is going to be impossible. I'm not going to be able to do it. All right, now I'm working forward. We've got this kind of dark row of greens. I'm going to make the texture here a little bit darker, the shadows a little bit stronger. This is the time to start putting in little details. But again, don't make things too strong because we need room to go much, much stronger towards the foreground and the middle ground. We still have a lot of room to go. If you exhaust your darks back here, what are you going to do when it comes time to getting some of the darker shadows here? You're not going to be able to do anything. Okay, so I'm going to work on this a little bit. I'm going to speed this up so you guys don't fall asleep. And then once we start dealing with the trees here, we'll come back and talk. Okay, now let's start working to get some of the texture on the trees in the middle ground. So now I'm gonna look for the shadows and start to go a little bit darker. Actually, you know what, we forgot to fill in this little area. There's some lighter leaves here. Let's quickly do that. Now, sometimes the paper texture itself can create the impression of leaves. So if you keep your brush a little bit on the drier side, you can kind of scrape the edge and that creates this kind of leafy texture. That works particularly well on trees towards the back, which is kind of what I was doing back here. All right, let's start going into the shadows here. I want to be careful not to go too dark. There are some strong darks back here, but we want to reserve our darkest shadows for the foreground. At this stage, I can start putting in some of the little branches, right, that are coming out. So these dark branches here, I can start putting them in. And some of the shadows. Some of the texture of the leaves here. Okay, so let's bounce to the next row up. Okay, I worked a little bit more on the middle ground trees to get a little bit of texture. Again, the most important thing is to be consistent with atmospheric perspective and not make the trees that are towards the background too dark, and to make sure that the trees that are closer go a little bit darker and that make the texture a little bit stronger. So as I'm working forward, I'm increasing the size of my brush stroke and darkening the texture a little bit so that the tree pops forward. This aspect is more important than getting the texture of the leaves exactly right. Because, look, style can vary. You can have a drawing with very little detail, a drawing with a tremendous amount of detail that's photorealistic. In both cases, though, the atmospheric perspective has to be consistent in order for the painting, the ink wash drawing, to be convincing. Otherwise, you're not going to have depth. So pay attention to atmospheric perspective. It's the most important aspect in landscape drawing, even more important than linear perspective. Okay, let me pop over to the foreground trees and start putting in my details. Those details are going to be pretty strong. So first thing I'm going to do is start getting some of these really dark patches in the tree trunk. And then going even darker. Again, not painting every single patch with complete faithfulness. I'm just trying to get the general idea of what these patches of light and dark on the trunk look like. Okay, so I'm going to speed this up, and then when we come back, we'll do maybe the shadows on the road. Alright, so this piece is sneaking little by little closer and closer to completion. I definitely have a sense of atmospheric perspective. Things are looking like they're closer here. Now it's time to start going towards my extremes of dark towards the foreground. So I'm going to start doing that, and then probably one of the last things I'm going to do is lay in this kind of complicated pattern of cast shadow on the floor, and then my piece will be pretty much done, or at least taken as far to completion as I have time for. Okay, almost finished here. We need to add a little bit of contrast here and there, particularly in the foreground. Now, the problem is that the foreground here is relatively soft. We've got a little bit of ground, a little bit of grass. It's up to me as the artist to emphasize the closeness of the area by pushing the contrast. So I'm going to go in and find opportunities for slightly stronger detail, slightly stronger texture. Again, this is something that maybe I'm seeing, but I'm definitely exaggerating. So the brushstrokes here are going to be a little bit larger, crispier. I'm going to try not to blend out this area quite so much so that it really starts to stand out. When you're working with landscape, it's most often not perfect in terms of composition, in terms of atmospheric perspective. It's up to you to make it perfect. It's up to you to make it better. You don't have perfect control. Plus, the added complication working outdoors, besides the flies, the wind, the dust, is the fact that light moves. So you're going to start off with one light direction in the morning, and then if you work for a couple hours by the afternoon, the light is going to be entirely a different spot. Which means quite often you are going to have to come back to the same spot on the same day and hope for the same weather conditions. Or you're going to have to do something called fixing the light source. So basically indicating where the shadows are from the very beginning and then staying with them, which involves a lot of memorizing what's actually happening. It involves painting quite often things that are not quite there, but used to be there. So this is something obviously we can't really discuss too much because we're working from photograph, but working from observation involves a lot more difficulties than working from a photograph. You have to have the ability to work from both though. Quite often as artists, we're not going to have access to everything we need to include in our image. We're going to have to use photo references. You have to know how to use them, what to include, what to leave out, what to emphasize when working from a photograph. That's a really useful skill. So we lost something for not being able to work from observation, but we gained quite a lot of other stuff. So I'm going to increase the contrast of the shadow here. By the way, when you're putting down cast shadows, make sure that they run more or less kind of horizontal, because this cast shadow is laying flat on a plane that's receding back in space. I'm going to reinforce the value here to get this cast shadow to really pop forward, and then I'm going to soften the edges a little bit because cast shadows at this distance have slightly softer edges. Okay, so I'm going to tinker with this a little bit more off camera, take a photo, but let's consider this exercise, this demo, more or less done.